It starts with a scream that never reaches the air. Deep inside the concrete maze of Pelican Bay, a man sits on the edge of his bunk, his hands trembling under the flicker of a dying fluorescent light. His name is Rafael Torres, and for the past 8 years, he hasn't spoken a single word. Not to his cellmate, not to the guards, not even to himself. The only sound he makes is the slow drag of his breath, in and out, while his eyes trace the carved initials on the wall. Dozens of names, dozens of ghosts. All of the men who once ran the yards of Pelican Bay, now reduced to scratches in cold cement. No one remembers when Torres stopped talking. Some say it was after his brother was stabbed in the exercise yard. Others say it was after his mother died and the prison denied his request to attend her funeral. But the truth, the real reason, is buried in the silence that surrounds this place. Pelican Bay doesn't just cage men. It erases them. In 2025, California's most infamous prison is no longer what it was in the 90s. The old gangs, Nuestra Familia, Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, have splintered, divided by new alliances, new bloodlines, and a new generation raised entirely behind bars. They call them the 2025 sets, microgangs born inside isolation cells. No colors, no flags, just coded tattoos and whispered loyalty. Their leaders don't walk the yard. They command through walls, through smuggled notes, through the echo of fear. And in the middle of it all is Rafael Torres, a man once known as Ghost Rider, the enforcer who could start a war with a single look. Now he's a phantom, locked in the security housing unit, the SHU, where time doesn't move and sunlight feels like a rumor. Every morning at 4 a.m., the same routine. A metal slot opens. A tray slides in. Oatmeal. A boiled egg. Water in a cracked cup. The slot slams shut. He eats in silence, eyes fixed on the small vent where the voice sometimes comes through. "Ghost, you still there?" It's a whisper. Another inmate, 2 cells down. A man he's never seen. The voice belongs to someone who calls himself Spider. He's young, maybe 23, and he's part of a new group that calls themselves the Sons. A hybrid gang, born out of fragments of the Mexican Mafia and the Black Guerrilla family. They don't care about race. They care about control. Spider tells Torres that the Sons are planning something big, something that could shake Pelican Bay to its core. But Torres never responds. He just listens. And maybe that's why Spider keeps talking. Because in Pelican Bay, silence can mean respect or death. Outside, the fog rolls in from Crescent City. It coats the walls, the towers, the razor wire. The guards walk the tiers with heavy boots and tired eyes. They've seen men set themselves on fire. They've seen cells flood with blood after a fight gone wrong. But they've never seen Torres flinch. One of them, Officer Daniels, keeps a file on him. It's thick. Pages filled with incident reports, tattoos, gang links, and notes from psychiatric evaluations. Displays dissociative behavior. Possible trauma-related mutism. Extreme self-control. Dangerous. Daniels doesn't buy the mutism. He thinks Torres is playing the long game. Guys like him don't go quiet, he mutters to another guard. They reload. But something about Torres is changing. One night, the lights flicker out during a lockdown. In the pitch-black corridor, Torres hears it, a whispering chant, echoing from cell to cell. A coded rhythm, a message being passed through pipes and vents. It's the new order of Pelican Bay, and Spider is part of it. The Sons are claiming the SHU as their territory, a place no gang has ever controlled before. Their plan is to unite inmates across racial lines and take power from both the guards and the old-school shot callers. But unity in Pelican Bay is a myth. Every alliance is a trap waiting to be sprung. When the power comes back, Torres finds something on his food tray. A folded piece of paper, barely bigger than a matchbox. He opens it carefully. Inside, a symbol, 2 interlocking serpents, and one message. "We remember who you are." For the first time in years, Torres blinks twice, slow, deliberate, and looks up at the vent. Spider whispers again. "They want you back, Ghost. It's time." Torres doesn't answer, but his pulse changes. His breathing quickens. Something stirs behind those dark eyes, something that's been buried under years of silence. In 2025, Pelican Bay isn't just a prison. It's a battleground of generations, where the old guard of violence meets the new digital underground. Contraband phones, drone drops, coded transfers. Gangs evolve faster than the system that built them. And in that chaos, men like Torres become legends or ghosts. The guards sense it too. Daniels writes in his report, "Inmate Torres exhibits signs of agitation. Possible communication with outside network. Recommend monitoring of all food slots, vents, and meal times." But by the time he files the report, it's already too late. Something's about to break. Late one night, as rain slams against the roof of the SHU, the intercom bursts alive, static, then shouting. Lockdown. Full lockdown. Boots thunder down the corridor. Doors slam. Radios crackle. A body has been found in cell 32, strangled with a bedsheet. No witnesses, no cameras working. The dead man's name, Spider, and written on the wall in blood are just 2 words. Not yet. The guards look at Torres through the slot. He's sitting exactly where he always sits, on the edge of the bunk, staring at the wall. But this time, his lips are moving. Daniels leans closer. What's he saying? A rookie asks. Daniels listens. The words are faint, broken. Torres whispers. They're not done. That's the moment Pelican Bay changes forever. Because the silence that protected Torres is about to become a war cry. And whatever the sun started, it's spreading beyond the walls. Rafael Torres wasn't always silent. 10 years ago, he walked the streets of Los Angeles with the roar of a city in his chest. He was 16, fast-talking, fearless, with tattoos already spiraling down his arms and across his chest, marks of loyalty and defiance. His first gang wasn't the Mexican mafia or any national cartel. It was a local crew, a brotherhood of survival. They called themselves Los Fuegos. Los Fuegos thrived in the shadows, abandoned warehouses, graffiti-covered alleys, underground fights. Torres was the type who saw the world as black and white, loyalty or betrayal. Every fight was a test, every betrayal a lesson carved into memory. By 18, he had earned a reputation. People whispered his name, Ghostwriter. They said he could disappear into thin air during a fight, only to strike from the shadows. They said he had eyes that saw through the lies of everyone around him. They weren't wrong. But fame on the street was a dangerous thing. One night, a robbery went wrong. Guns flashed, glass shattered, and 2 lives ended before anyone knew what hit them. Torres got caught. The authorities said he had masterminded it, but the truth was blurrier. Fear, rage, and youth had collided, and the law always wins when it's patient. He was 17 when the trial began. The court saw a boy, but the street saw a predator. And the judge? He saw a man too dangerous to return to the streets. Pelican Bay welcomed him at 19. The first night in the SHU was like stepping into another universe. Concrete walls stretched higher than he had imagined. Metal doors clanged like thunder, and the echo of footsteps bounced endlessly. The air smelled of bleach and despair. Torres didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Every sound, a distant shout, a lock turning, a tray sliding through a slot, drilled into his mind. His first cellmate was silent too. A man older, hardened by decades inside, tattoos running like rivers down his arms, eyes sunken and hollow. The older inmate didn't speak. He didn't need to. Torres learned quickly, silence is power. Words can betray you. Words can make you a target. In the SHU, even the smallest gestures become language. The tilt of a head, the placement of hands, a glance down the corridor. Torres adapted. He watched the guards, the fellow inmates, the routines. He learned the hierarchy, who could be challenged, who demanded obedience. He learned fear, and he learned patience. By the 3rd year, Torres had built a reputation, not through violence, at least not in the open, but through observation. He could predict fights before they happened. He knew which doors would open, which guards were weak, which inmates were plotting betrayal. He became a ghost in the literal sense, everywhere and nowhere at once. And then came the death that changed him forever. It was a Tuesday. Torres had requested to see the yard. A small reprieve, 15 minutes of fresh air, something every SHU inmate cherished. The guard opened the door, letting him step into the cold wind. He could hear the distant crash of water hitting metal, the fog rolling across the perimeter. But a fight broke out. One of the new generation, a member of a rival gang, lunged at a friend of Torres's. Chaos erupted. Guards shouted, batons clanged, men screamed. Torres tried to intervene, to pull his friend away, but it was too late. His brother-in-arms, a young man barely 20, was stabbed repeatedly. By the time the medics arrived, the man was gone. Torres didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't speak. He sat on the cold cement floor, listening to the echo of sirens and shouting fade. And that's when he made a choice. Words would never save him again. Years in isolation followed. Days bled into nights. The SHU is designed to break a person, and it almost did. Torres watched men lose their minds over months of monotony, banging their heads against walls, screaming into emptiness, scratching messages into concrete that no one would read. He witnessed the rise and fall of gangs inside those walls, saw allegiances form and shatter like glass. But Torres endured. He learned to read the unspoken language of the SHU. He noticed subtle changes in the guards' routines. He memorized patterns of every inmate who came and went from the tier. He even learned to communicate silently, with small signals and gestures, across walls and vents. By the 7th year, he had become a legend in Pelican Bay, a man who could influence events without speaking a word. He had mastered the art of observation, calculation, and intimidation. Other inmates, young, brash, desperate, began seeking his guidance. They called him the Ghost. It was during these years that the seeds of the Sons were planted. A younger generation of inmates was rising, disconnected from the old gangs. They weren't interested in long-standing rivalries. They were focused on power, survival, and influence inside the SHU. They respected knowledge and cunning above brute force. Torres became their silent mentor. Spider, the young inmate who would later whisper into his vent, was one of the first to approach him. A thin, sharp-eyed man with tattoos already covering his arms. Spider didn't beg for leadership. He sought strategy, secrets, and patience. He learned from Torres how to move within the walls without attracting unnecessary attention, how to survive and make allies in a place that was designed to destroy both. Torres never spoke to Spider in the conventional sense, but in the quiet moments, during tray drops, during exercise yard shadows, through subtle glances and hand movements, he taught him everything a man needed to survive Pelican Bay. The psychology of Torres's transformation is clear. Isolation warps perception. Prolonged fear sharpens instinct. Trauma numbs the voice. What emerges is a mind tuned to reading danger, exploiting weaknesses, and surviving at all costs. And yet, there was another side, the part that remained human, fragile, and haunted by loss. Torres remembered his street years, the friends he couldn't save, the brother-in-arms who died in his first yard fight. Every decision, every signal, every silent warning was shadowed by the ghosts of his past. It's a paradox. He became untouchable because he withdrew completely from human speech. Yet his influence inside the prison grew stronger than any gang leader who shouted and banged tables. By 2025, Rafael Torres had created a delicate balance of fear and respect. He was a figure who could tip events in the SHU with a gesture. He could orchestrate alliances and control disputes without uttering a word. Yet, he remained deeply isolated, a man suspended between life and legend, memory and action. Guards noticed it. Inmate analysts, psychologists, and even reporters who were occasionally allowed inside knew his reputation. Ghost Rider, they called him. The man who stopped talking. The man who sees all. The man who waits. And in that waiting, something was stirring. The Sons, Spider, and the new gang generation saw the opportunity to claim the SHU as their territory. Torres's silence was no longer just defense. It had become a symbol, a weapon, and a strategy. The SHU is a pressure cooker. Every day, the air grows heavier, filled with sweat, fear, and the faint metallic tang of blood. By 2025, Pelican Bay was no longer just a prison. It had become a chessboard, walls, cells, and corridors as squares, and the inmates as pieces moving in silence, in secrecy, under the careful watch of guards who only saw the surface of the game. Rafael Torres, the Ghost, sat on his bunk, eyes tracing the faint scratches on the walls, listening to the rhythm of footsteps along the corridor. He knew something was coming, something that would disturb the fragile balance inside the SHU. It started with whispers, small gestures from the young inmates, tattoos that had been added in the shadows, secret signals flicking from cell to cell. The Sons, Torres's protégés, were organizing. They weren't just looking to survive anymore. They wanted to control. They studied the guards' routines, memorized meal times, and observed how the older gangs operated. The Mexican mafia's reach had weakened, splintered by decades of incarceration and generational change. The Aryan Brotherhood still ruled some territories, but they moved cautiously, aware that any rash action could backfire. And in between, the sons were spreading like wildfire, a network born of stealth and patience. Torres had not spoken in 8 years, but his influence was undeniable. The new gang leaders came to him in silence, showing their loyalty with subtle gestures, a nod, a tilt of the head, a folded piece of paper pushed through a food slot. They sought strategies, timing, and guidance. The tension was visible even to the guards. Officer Daniels, now a decade into his service, noted the change in the logs. Multiple reports of coordination among new inmates. Possible plan to assert dominance over SHU. Torres may be involved indirectly. The challenge for Torres was not just survival. It was calculation. One wrong move, and the SHU could descend into chaos. A storm where loyalty and bloodshed blurred into the fog. It began subtly. One morning, the SHU awoke to a fight in the corner of cell block C. 2 young inmates from rival factions, both tattooed and wearing orange jumpsuits, lunged at each other over a stolen contraband item. The clatter of metal and the echo of fists hitting flesh rang out. Guards rushed in, shouting, batons swinging, and yet Torres remained silent. He observed. He did not intervene, but he took note. Which guards responded fastest, which inmates hesitated, which alliances held. By the afternoon, messages had traveled through vents, subtle and coded. The sons were signaling across tiers, using signals only Torres had taught them. A scratch in the wall, a folded paper, a shift in posture. What began as isolated fights quickly escalated into territorial claims within the SHU itself. The older inmates watched with cautious fear. They remembered Torres from the days when his name alone could start a war. They had underestimated the ghost, the one who does not speak but moves entire factions with his mind. The turning point came during lockdown drills. Guards announced a routine lockdown. Inmates were told to stay in cells. The corridors emptied. The fluorescent lights flickered, shadows twisting across walls. Torres leaned back on his bunk, arms crossed, tattoos glowing faintly under the flickering light. His eyes followed Spider, who had placed small signals across 3 tiers. By the time the guards made their rounds, several young inmates had moved subtly, leaving notes and messages where the old gangs could see them. It was not confrontation, but challenge. The sons were staking their claim. Then, the unthinkable happened. A full-scale riot erupted. It started in one cell block, a fight over food trays that had been tampered with. Shouts echoed through the concrete corridors. Metal doors banged. Guards moved quickly, but the chaos spread faster than they anticipated. Torres did not scream or run. He remained on his bunk, silently calculating. He watched as Spider and the sons coordinated movements, the placement of obstacles, the use of light shadows, even subtle noises to distract guards. Within minutes, the fight escalated. Tattooed inmates in orange jumpsuits clashed, alliances shattered, and fear rippled through the SHU like a physical wave. From the guards' perspective, it was total chaos. Radios crackled. Officer Daniels shouted orders. Batons clanged. Tear gas canisters were readied. And in the middle of it all, Torres observed, untouchable, guiding the sons through nonverbal commands. The tension was suffocating. Each second stretched into an eternity. Every move could mean life or death. Amid the chaos, a critical moment occurred. Spider was cornered by a rival faction, a man twice his size, covered in tattoos, orange jumpsuit bright under the flickering lights. The air smelled of sweat and fear. Spider froze. The guards were moments away. And then Torres acted, silently. He shifted his weight, subtly, signaling another inmate in the adjacent cell to act. A distraction, a table slammed against the bars. Spider's attacker turned, and Spider escaped through a narrow gap. No one spoke, but the command had been understood. Torres had saved him without a word. It was a lesson in control, a demonstration that words were unnecessary. The riot lasted hours. By the time calm returned, several inmates had been injured, bruises and scratches marring orange jumpsuits. The SHU smelled of blood, sweat, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Guards filed reports. Analysts began piecing together the chain of events. and Torres returned to his bunk as if nothing had happened. Yet the power balance had shifted. The sons had proven their presence. The old gangs were aware that a silent strategist now controlled the tides. Torres, however, was not celebrating. He knew that control in Pelican Bay is fragile. One betrayal, one misstep, and the walls could collapse around him. Every cell, every vent, every shadow held danger. The psychological strain was immense. For Torres, every day was a calculated battle. The old trauma, the loss of his brother in arms, the years of isolation, all merged with the constant tension of the SHU. The human mind is resilient, but fragile, and Torres had learned to balance on that edge. He spent nights observing, memorizing, and anticipating. The sons trained quietly under his guidance, learning which alliances to form, which to break, and which moments to exploit. They became extensions of his will, acting without words, thinking as he thought. And the guards? They sensed a growing threat. Officer Daniels filed notes describing unusual coordination among the inmates, unexplained movements during lockdowns, and strange signals between cells. They saw Torres sitting on his bunk, calm, silent, unshakable, and they could not understand how one man could orchestrate so much without speaking. But Torres knew their weakness. He knew their routines, their patterns, their assumptions. He had learned that control is often invisible, like the flow of water beneath ice. And when the ice breaks, it does so suddenly, with devastating force. By the end of the chapter, Pelican Bay had changed. The sons had emerged from the shadows, the old gangs had retreated slightly, and the ghost remained the center of an invisible web. The SHU had quieted, not because the storm had passed, but because silence had returned. A fragile, deliberate, waiting silence. The chaos that had erupted during the riot now lay like a memory pressed into concrete. Bruises healed, though scars remained. Fear lingered, as persistent as the fog rolling through the corridors. And Rafael Torres, the ghost, sat on his bunk, arms crossed, tattoos catching the faint flicker of fluorescent lights, staring at the same wall he had been studying for years. He did not speak. Silence had become more than a weapon. It was a shield, a method of control, a psychological cloak that allowed him to see without being seen, to act without being touched. He had watched lives shatter, alliances crumble, and yet he remained untouchable. In Pelican Bay, the SHU had a rhythm, the echo of footsteps, the distant clatter of trays, the soft hum of ventilation systems, and Torres had learned to read it like a language. The aftermath of the riot rippled through every corner of the prison. The sons, under Torres's silent guidance, had established a foothold in the SHU. Their dominance was subtle, almost invisible. They controlled movement, influenced minor disputes, and dictated the flow of contraband. They had no formal meetings, no banners, no colors, just small gestures, coded messages, and the unwavering presence of a mentor who did not speak. Yet power came at a cost. Psychologically, the young inmates bore the weight of constant vigilance. Every glance, every whispered signal, could tip the balance of control. A wrong move could mean injury, isolation, or worse. They learned patience and calculation, lessons Torres had absorbed from a decade of watching men break under the weight of isolation. For the older gangs, the riot had been a reminder of the changing tide. The Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, remnants of Nuestra Familia, all had been forced to recalibrate. The SHU, once ruled by brute force and reputation, was now a landscape where intelligence, patience, and observation mattered more than muscle. Even the guards noticed. Officer Daniels, veteran of countless incidents, filed extensive reports. Coordination among younger inmates is increasing. Leadership appears centralized but nonverbal. Recommend continued observation. The dynamics inside the SHU are shifting. The old hierarchy is weakening. The language was bureaucratic, clinical, but beneath the words was unease. Everyone understood. The ghost still controlled the pulse of the SHU. Torres spent hours on his bunk, tracing the scratches on the wall, remembering the names carved into cement over the years. Each mark was a story. Men who had fought, men who had died, men who had vanished. He traced them with his finger, the skin of his tattooed arms brushing against the cold concrete. The echoes of the past were tangible. Sometimes he thought about his brother in arms, the the young man who had died years ago in the exercise yard. Sometimes he remembered Spider, the boy who had survived the riot through his silent guidance. And sometimes he allowed himself a fleeting memory of the streets, Los Angeles, alleys lit by flickering neon, the roar of cars, the laughter and screams of his teenage crew. Isolation had stolen many things, but it had not stolen his mind. The psychological toll, however, was evident in every inmate. In the aftermath of the riot, counselors reported increased anxiety, insomnia, and flashbacks among both the young gang members and the older prisoners. The SHU's design, prolonged silence, minimal human contact, regimented routines, amplified these effects. Torres understood this. He had lived it, and in many ways, he had mastered it. He had become the embodiment of the SHU, silent, observing, strategic. He was no longer just a man. He was a presence, a force that existed in the cracks and shadows. Letters, rare and censored, carried fragments of the outside world. They reminded Torres that life continued beyond concrete walls and razor wire. He read them meticulously, sometimes aloud to himself in whispers so soft that no one could hear. Words from his mother, before she passed, remained etched in memory. Words from his few remaining allies on the outside reminded him that the world beyond the prison still moved, though slowly, almost unbearably distant. Yet the prison had changed him. The man who once ran the streets of Los Angeles, who had laughed in the face of danger, who had fought and bled for territory and respect, now existed in a space measured by footsteps, whispers, and observation. Power was quiet now. Violence, when it occurred, was calculated. Survival was measured in patience and timing, in subtlety rather than confrontation. And yet, the danger remained. The Sons were powerful, but not invincible. Rival factions waited, watching, testing boundaries. Any misstep could reignite chaos. And the older gangs were biding their time, waiting for opportunity. The SHU, once predictable, was now a living organism of tension, strategy, and fear. Torres's influence was a double-edged sword. It protected him, yes, but it also made him a target. In Pelican Bay, power attracts attention, and attention can be deadly. In the quiet hours, Torres sometimes thought about the meaning of his life behind bars. He had survived what most men could not endure. He had learned to read the world without speaking. He had taught others to survive without a voice. But at what cost? The walls of the SHU whispered in his mind. Reminders of the men who had lost their sanity, of those who had disappeared without trace, of those who had died screaming alone. He could feel their presence in every corner, in the fog of the corridors, in the flicker of fluorescent lights, in the scrape of metal against metal. And he wondered, who truly survived in Pelican Bay? The body? The mind? Or the ghost that lingers long after the flesh is gone? By the end of 2025, Torres's story had become legend inside the prison. New inmates heard tales of the ghost before they even stepped into the SHU. The Sons continued to operate under his silent guidance. Guards approached each day with caution. Analysts debated his influence. Psychologists studied his behavior. And yet, despite all observation, Torres remained a mystery. He never boasted. He never sought attention. He only waited. He watched. He acted when necessary. And in that silence, he was more powerful than any shouting leader, more feared than any violent instigator. And yet, the most haunting part was not his power. It was the knowledge that isolation, trauma, and violence had created him. That the SHU, designed to break men, had instead forged a figure who was both human and myth, fragile and unstoppable. That Pelican Bay, in its cold and unforgiving design, had produced a man who no longer needed words to command fear and respect. Torres understood something fundamental. A silent mind can see everything, hear everything, and predict everything. And in that silence, a single gesture can be more powerful than a scream, a subtle glance more lethal than a fist. The final days of the year passed quietly. The SHU returned to its regimented rhythm. Meals slid through slots. Guards walked the tiers. Inmates in orange jumpsuits sat on bunks, tattooed arms crossed, eyes alert. But beneath the surface, a network moved invisibly. The Sons continued their operations. The old gangs watched, restrained. And Torres, ever the ghost, observed from his bunk, a living testament to survival, strategy, and the human mind under pressure. As the camera pans back through the fogged corridors of Pelican Bay, the echoes of the year's events linger. The riot, the whispered commands, the subtle dominance of a man who never spoke. The SHU is calm, yet alive, breathing in tension, calculating every move. A prison as much mental as physical. Torres sits quietly. Tattoos, orange jumpsuit, shadowed eyes. The scratches on the wall tell stories. The faint light hints at danger. The silence hums with anticipation. He is the embodiment of Pelican Bay itself. Unyielding, watchful, patient. And the haunting question remains. In a place designed to erase men, who truly survives? The body, the mind, or the ghost that lingers in silence?